And sometimes I try to restrain myself. Sometimes for people who are more used to me, I try to take them through a little bit of this easily. But yeah, there's something so compelling about the idea, and I think most of it comes from these first 2 points. That there are a lot of examples of physical use and disuse and their influences on physical performance and physical health. I was taught a few decades ago, and I think this is true, that actually the first uses of use it or lose it had to do with the atrophy of the sexual organs in older adults who were not sexually active at all and had not been for a long time. And then certainly it comes up in the Masters and Johnson work on sexuality back in the 60s. That one of the things that they're pointing to is that their old age samples were very small for all their stuff about aging. But they point out that the physical changes associated with aging, especially in women, seem not to be there in women who are sexually active. Actually, what I remember of Masters and Johnson, it actually doesn't seem to matter if that activity involves a partner or if it's solo activity. It's just that you continue being active against a lot of the changes that we thought they were aging. And then, of course, for a few decades now, we've known that physical activity is good for keeping your cardiovascular system going, keeping your respiratory system going, increasing evidence of strength training and so forth, being good for muscle, preventing sarcopenia, muscle loss, and frailty, and also for bone density, cutting down on osteoporosis-related loss and so forth. So you have all these examples in the physical domain that do seem to work, and then it just makes so much sense that if physical exercise is good for your body, then mental exercise should be good for your mind. I mean, it sounds so good. It's just like it has to be right. And then both I think in the popular imagination and in the a lot of the literature, especially the non-experimental, non-intervention kind of literature, you do have this kind of correlation interpreted as causation thing. I mean, it's quite clear that mental activity and intellectual ability go together. I think that there's very little doubt that the two things are correlated across the age range. The question is whether it's use it or lose it, or whether it's if you've lost it you can't use it. So, and longitudinal data helps some, but you get into these issues about the time of the measurement versus the time of the effects. Sometimes we kind of get caught up in this thinking that because we only know something at a certain time, that's when it started. So for example, if you think about one of the most common examples popularly and certainly in gerontology is that we date a lot of things about the progress of dementia from when we get the diagnosis of dementia. But I think it's quite clear that people are in decline for a while before you get the diagnosis. And there may be prodromal signs that go back even well before that. But on average, I think that people have been seeing cognitive and behavioral changes for something like a couple of years before you get a clear diagnosis of dementia. And that's probably in places where diagnostic work is pretty clear cut. And just because you measure personality when somebody's in their 30s doesn't mean that they didn't have the same personality when they were 20. Or just because you introduce any particular measure at a particular time because you measure one thing ahead of the other doesn't necessarily mean that it occurs before the other. So you can see the effects of activity on health or effects of activity on mental alertness. It may be that the mental alertness was there throughout the person's life, and you just happen to measure the activity before you measure the alertness. This is actually an issue for some of the argument that Herzog et al. Make in this paper, because one of the ways that they try to strengthen some of the longitudinal studies on use it or lose it is to suppose that you would only see the effects of Alzheimer's disease for a few years before the diagnosis is clear-cut. So the prodromal phase would probably be limited to, I forget exactly the number that they use, but something like 3 years or so. And you know, there is this evidence that's usually interpreted as signs of the beneficial effects of cognitive reserve. You know, you have this data from like the Nun study, and then from this Scottish study where they have IQ scores from people that are like 10, and then they link that to people's risk of dementia at age 70. You know the story of the study? Like, somebody's just like they were like cleaning out the basement in this like city hall type building in Scotland, and stumbled across these boxes full of IQ tests from 50 years before or something. They figured out that these 10-year-olds were now 60, 70 years of age. And it's good, so they kicked off this longitudinal study. And it turns out that your IQ, as measured at age 10, is a pretty significant predictor of risk for Alzheimer's disease by age 70 and beyond. The Nun study, they had these autobiographical essays that the sisters wrote as they entered the convent at like 18, 20 years of age. And then they looked at their risk for Alzheimer's disease in their 60s and 70s, and they had there's metrics that you can use for how complicated the thinking is that goes into a prose sample. You can look at vocabulary and the complexity of your syntax and so forth, and you can rate passages for how complicated they are. And it turns out that the complexity of the writing at 18 predicts dementia later on. The optimistic interpretation of that is if you start off life with a lot of cognitive reserve, then you've got money in the bank, and you can burn through some of it before you get demented. We'll come back to this one with the Herzog and I'll figure it a little bit. I suppose the more dismal interpretation is maybe Alzheimer's disease starts really early. And if you're actually, if you've got the risk, if you've got the genetic load, or if you've got the biological risk, maybe your brain like never develops that as much as people who don't have the risk. There is also some stuff of like looking at APOE4 and the APOE4 and the people's GPA in high school and college.
It's actually a really interesting point, because with a lot of other medical conditions, you don't wake up in the morning and all of a sudden have heart disease. Like that's 20 or 30 years of eating fast food and not exercising. So it'd be kind of interesting if that went along the same lines. If that is something that starts at like 20 or so.
And on the plus side of this, James Mortimer is one of the people who advances this argument. He's one of the major sort of mental health epidemiologists about dementia in the U.S. and he's made this argument from time to time. And he seems like the positive side of attending to this is that it means that you could identify people at risk really, really early. And that there's a good bet that a lot of what we're ever going to be able to do about Alzheimer's would be stuff that you would need to do really, really early. And that by sort of glossing over the possibility that the risk is there